So how much greater it is than the sum of its parts, because we're all weak and broken vessels, and yet the altar is there, the chalice is there, the liturgy is there. There are priests there who will hear our confession if we would go to them. There are those who are starting monastic orders and fighting for these things. And so the third thing is this. Unlike those who are despairing, we do not need to despair. The gates of hell will not prevail against the Church of Jesus Christ. Moreover, we can have a true program of orthodoxy, and that is to be orthodox ourselves. And one of the things that will do, and it's not the reason we should do it, frankly, because we want to go to paradise, but one of the results that we'll have is it will heal the small divisions. People talk about, well, when there will be unity between Greek and Russian. I'll tell you when. When they are both working together in the greatest missionary enterprise the world has ever seen, and that is the evangelization of the pagan nation of the United States of America. That's when we'll be one church. When will there be unity between Antiochians and Russians and Greeks? When Antiochian, Russian, and Greek are a lot more interested in the heart of what monasticism has to teach than they are in simply building their individual social clubs. And it can happen. Right now, we see it happening in what was Russia. Yes, that church there also has its problems and corruptions, and they are many. But we see a true revival taking place. And I would like to end today by simply telling you, for 2 minutes, a brief story from that revival that should give us hope that if it can happen there, it can happen here. In a small town near Kiev in the Ukraine, there was a church that in the late 1920s, the Cheka blew up. They blew the roof off of it, only the walls were left standing, and then they ordered the townspeople, ordered them to make that church the refuse dump for the city. They built a ramp outside of the church. It had good thick walls, and they made everybody dump their garbage in their place of worship. And some people resisted and were shot. And so people started dumping their garbage there, and this went on through the whole communist period. And it became the garbage dump of this small town, to the point where both outside and inside the walls, the church was filled with trash and garbage and stinking stench. And in the Gorbachev era, when things began to loosen up a little bit, one of the government agencies that owned the garbage area was approached by an old priest saying, "Can we have our church back?" Well, where's our church? Well, our church is the city garbage dump. It's now buried under there. We'd like our church back. And I don't know whether facetiously or generously or unthinkingly, they said, "Sure, you can have your church back." I'm sure with a smile. And then the priest applied and he said, I need some moving equipment to move a truck or a bulldozer or something to move 70 years of a rather large community's trash away to the other side of the town where the new trash dump has been. We're not giving you any equipment. You have your building back. You move the garbage. This is garbage piled higher than your cathedral here, over a small country church. What was the priest to do? Well, in ones and twos, town people started coming and began with their own hands and a pick or a shovel, whatever they could get, digging out, and it seemed quite hopeless, and the priest never thought it would change. And then, one day, more and more people showed up until they had formed a human chain, and with their bare hands, for 3 or 4 weeks continuously, night and day, they passed the trash from that trash dump all the way across town to another. And the church now began to reemerge, and there were the soiled, stained, filthy walls of this desecrated building. But the altar was still there. Chipped, broken, standing. The iconostasis rotted away, nothing left. And the priest, on the day they finally cleared it out with the stink of garbage around him, said, "We're going to hold a liturgy here. But we need some icons." This was at the beginning of the thaw, not now, when of course they would all be available. "But we don't have any. We have a problem." And there was an old lady in the congregation. By the way, for those of you who are not Orthodox, all the heroes are old ladies. They always come to the rescue at the end. There was an old lady in the church. Who said, "I have some icons. In fact, I have the icon of the Blessed Theotokos that used to be right here, and I have the icon of Christ that used to be right there. Look, this is where they used to stand." "How can you have these icons? The church was blown up almost 60 years ago." Here's the story. She was 12. They had wired the church with explosives. They were about to light the fuse. And this little girl, no one special, quote unquote, of course a saint, but no one special in our eyes, ran into the back of the church with the fuses actually lit. And the reason she got away with it is because the people who were blowing the roof off the church had already moved to a safe distance. She waited until they lit the fuse and ran away. Then she ran in to save the Theotokos and the icon of Christ. And with her own hands, she carried them out of the back door, took them back to her farm, and hid them. Her parents, because they were devout Orthodox, were eventually killed in one of Stalin's purges. All her family was gone, but she still knew where those icons were. Some 60 years later, as an old lady with her frail, blue-veined hands, she took them out, unwrapped them from the oilcloth. They were in perfect condition. She brought them back, and they had their first liturgy. The story is not over. In this same village, they wanted to put a new roof on the church and fix it up. They applied for a grant to the government. No, there's no money. The priest said, it's going to be years before we have a roof. We have no way to do this. There are no funds. The church has no funds. We're out here in the sticks. There's no way to do this. 2 days later, an old man knocked on his door, and he was holding in his hand a pillowcase. And he said to the priest, Father, build the roof. And the priest takes the pillowcase. It's rather heavy, and he opens it, and every wedding ring from the town was in it. That's all they had. Now, I would just say this to we who are Orthodox. This is our inheritance. This is our church. These are the shoulders of the giants upon which we stand. And we in our country have not done terribly well at resisting the easy seduction of American life when other Orthodox in Turkey and in the Soviet Union have resisted and paid with their lives. And the challenge to us is, therefore, not to build better and bigger and happier and larger social clubs ad infinitum, but to recapture the spirit of that church, which is the heart of spirituality and monasticism, so that in our own communities, the following generation will have better things to do than gossiping about the latest fight between the parish council and the priest. And will have better things to do than organizing big social events for spoiled children who have been introduced to the good life and not to the Good Shepherd. Thank you, and God bless you. Okay. Now thank you. Okay. We're going to have a time for some question and answers. We're going to have a time for question and answers. There's a microphone there. If you have a question, please make it brief. And then we'll go from this place. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just tell them how we'll do it.
It's okay. Let them they can line up. Yeah. If you have a question, come to the mic and don't be shy. Just come on up and wait and get in line. And please make it a question and not a statement, or we'll be here all day. And we'll go from there. A question, please.
Hi. Yes.
Yes, please.
And I appreciate I'm interested to see that done in a very wealthy and encouraged consumer materialistic way. You have Orthodox community in this country that cross the jurisdictional line, and I think that one of the problems here is that as Orthodox Christians, we're not very specific in Christ's words, where we don't recognize our relationship in the church as well as Christ. I was wondering, why is that not something that, as especially Orthodox people, is not emphasized? I find it very difficult being in the Orthodox community and having that separate feeling.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. That, by the way, don't wait until one question is finished to come up to the microphone, because then there'll be big gaps. So if someone else has a question or a comment, please come on up and just wait a moment, and then we'll be able to hear it. I would say it goes back to the point I was making. You see, I don't think there are simple solutions of appealing to people. You know, the world's way of doing things is like this. The world's way is like this. There's hunger or there's racism, so let's all hold hands, get together, sing We Are the World, and that'll fix it. Let's take kids in their schools, and when in their third grade, instead of having a white person in the coloring book, let's give them whites and brown people. They still come out of school hating each other. Why? Because the solution to sin is not a human program or a clever appeal or anything like this. The solution to sin, and what we're discussing here is sin, what you're discussing here is a sin. The solution is not three bishops sitting together and signing a statement, though that might help. The solution is the fact that our priorities are wrong, and we often are not concentrating on spirituality, we're concentrating on maintaining institutions. And why monasticism means so much to me is that it embodies the kind of spirituality that looks beyond our institutions here in terms of individual parishes or Greek versus Russian, and looks to the only institution that matters finally, which is the kingdom of heaven. And so it is that spirit that has to be captured. Now, a lot of times in the movie industry, for instance, when I've directed a scene that doesn't work well, I'm tempted to just sort of recut it and try to fit the pieces together, but there comes a time when you realize this. Look, this thing is no good. It cannot be fixed. I'm going to either have to reshoot this scene or cut it from the movie. It isn't just a matter of tinkering here and another meeting here or something like that. Similarly, the kind of problems of the heart we have in the Orthodox community in America are so large that they can only be cured by what is the ultimate Orthodox solution, and that is spiritual reawakening. Now, in the Protestant tradition, spiritual reawakening comes about momentarily because some evangelist or someone like Charles Finney or Billy Graham goes out there, rouses the troop, leaves the next day. There's no institution because they don't believe in the church. Protestants have churches, but they don't believe in the church to carry this on. We in the church have a treasure of monasticism. It has been part of our tradition. We have had monks and ascetics all the way from the beginning, as we have had priests and bishops. In America, we're missing half our body. We have church buildings, we have priests, we have bishops. We do not have monastic institutions, and therefore it is never going to be a perfect situation. But it is all too easy for we Christian Orthodox to concentrate on the things of this world, because we don't have, by example, the kind of communities I was just in, on Mount Athos, for instance, a place like Simonos Petra, where you have an ultimate and complete dedication to spiritual life and prayer, which most of us are not going to be able to imitate, but just seeing it there and knowing people are doing this is the inspiration for us to behave more like Christians. Having said that, it would never be perfect.
My problem is that as a student we are not seeing out across jurisdictional lines and seeking out against needs. They are here. America is disaster, but if we were more, as you say, spiritually awakened and less myopic and keeping our own interpretations.
Yeah.
We seek out our message very fully, pretty slowly, and most of us do not have things that can get us anyway, his point is well made.
Sure. Well, I would say two things, and then I'll take the people behind you there, because we have others in the discussion. One is this. Yes, there are monastic communities in America. You have some near here. I was just in Pennsylvania yesterday with Bishop Maximus, and he has several convents and other things going. However, if you study the history of the church, we do not have monastic communities in the sense that they are as common as churches. You have to understand that you only have to read a very little Byzantine history, for instance, to realize that almost every community had a monastery or a convent near it. There were as many monasteries and convents as there were church buildings in most places, of one form or another. It was common to have people living in skeets and in other things. We have them in the technical sense that every rural place in America may have a post office available to it somewhere theoretically. But the fact of the matter is, the spread of monasticism has yet to start in this country in terms of what the church knew in its history. I'll give you just one example. In Russia today, right now, there are more than 800 monasteries and convents that have reopened out of the more than 25,000 religious institutions that were eventually shut and destroyed by the Soviets, including small skeets, hermitages, and other things. And yet they, since the fall of communism in a mere half dozen years, have maybe 50 times more monastic institutions than we do in this country with the same population. So the fact of the matter is, we have monastics in America, good and holy men and women. They are not frequently found in communities in this country the way you frequently find churches. And they are not, as you quite rightly say, supported and sought out as they should be. And so my suggestion is a practical one. We make use of what we have already. We encourage those communities to grow as they see fit in their own spiritual wisdom. We give them the resources. We encourage young people at our seminaries to look at the monastic life as a realistic option instead of discouraging them and saying, oh, well, monastics kind of disappear into the woods. Why don't you become a priest instead? What's a monk got to do with it? We can encourage it in numerous ways, including ourselves, to begin to pray and to act a little more like monks in our own hearts in terms of confession and a cycle of prayer and so on. These things all will take time, and they all have to be small steps. It's not going to be an American solution of something that's all at once, but I think it's a direction we move in. And when it comes to healing the division in the church, I don't believe anything else finally will do that. I don't think a congress of bishops somewhere signing a piece of paper will do anything. I think it's a change of heart. Now, that plays a useful role, but finally I think it comes from within. Next question, sorry.
Reality and orthodoxy and Christ transforming culture and so forth. Although, you mentioned a lot of things where you differ as an Orthodox from your upbringing as an evangelical, do you think that some of the emphases of your father in Christ transforming culture and so forth are something that was a part of your life that played an influence, in a sense, to direct you into Greek Orthodoxy? And if so, what connection do you see between Greek Orthodoxy and that?
Yeah, I think that's a good connection. A good question. I feel it played a very great role. I think, in fact, you didn't ask this question, but just as a footnote, that my father was actually very much on the road to orthodoxy. The last book he wrote was The Great Evangelical Disaster. That was the title of the book. And he very much in his heart was seeking after orthodoxy. His own emphasis on prayer and fasting, for instance. His own idea of the fact that you had to have church order and discipline, and his own regret and mourning of the fact that Protestants had lost that. My father, perhaps knowing it, perhaps not knowing it, very, very much, almost on an instinctual level, was truly moving towards orthodoxy his whole life, away from harsh Reformed Calvinism and towards an orthodox vision of spirituality in the church. I think I got part of this idea, as it were, with my mother's milk. And so I think it's very natural that I wound up coming into the church. And I'm very grateful for those doors he opened. In terms of culture building, obviously, even a peripheral look at Orthodox history, you realize it's the greatest culture builder that there's ever been. This is the church that took a cow town in the Roman Empire, in the collapse of the Roman Empire, and very imperfectly, nevertheless, sustained the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, that unlike, for instance, the Spanish Roman Catholics, converted people at sword point, sent humble monks and missionaries like Cyril and Methodius to convert peaceably the whole Slavic Empire, the whole Slavic landmass, without a shot being fired. And so in Orthodoxy, you see not only the maintenance of culture and civility, for all the corruption of Byzantine intrigue of the emperors and so forth that we all know about, nevertheless, the church consistently pursued a course of holiness and also produced its saints like John Chrysostom and others, so that its inheritance is tremendously rich. And I would say, therefore, coming into the Orthodox Church in the modern era, when I look at people like Dostoevsky, for instance, and the brother Karamazov, and I see him writing a novel which brings people very much to consider the question of what it means to be a Christian in the modern atheistic Western world, that is in the best tradition of orthodoxy, that has always had a place for the arts and creativity. In fact, has included music and art and liturgy in its worship, never excluded it the way pietistic Protestantism of the Puritan kind did. Has always had this rich, unashamed physical tradition. All of this leads to a culture-building mentality. And so, in the modern age, when you look at the Orthodox Church, the potential for it reviving a tired and flagging Western society is large. However, I would just say this in conclusion. Orthodoxy, unlike, say, some utilitarian philosophies, does not preach its gospel because of the, quote, good practical result it will have. It still is looking at the heart. And so, yes, it has those results. It built those hospitals. Byzantium had all the orphanages and the foundling hospitals and all the stuff you would expect to come from Christianity. In fact, they were the first in the world. They paved the way. While the West was a backward, declining, fringe of smoking rubble on the edge of what was the Roman Empire, the so-called Dark Ages. Byzantium was the most advanced culture and civilization and the most humane society when it came to dealing with everything from foundling hospitals to homes for repentant prostitutes run by nuns. There was a level of civility there the world has scarcely seen since, in spite of the problems and corruption. And the missionary zeal that was not driven at sword point, but from the heart with the Cyril and Methodiuses of this world, in spite of the problems, was there. Yes. But in the end, our home is not here on earth. And finally, this is all very well and good, but what an Orthodox Christian wants to do, I believe, is to change their heart to become more like Christ, subdue the human passions, let Christ be the ruler of our lives, discipline ourselves not in some airy-fairy spiritual way, but practically within the church, by making honest confessions to our priests, by doing what they say, by preparing ourselves for the sacraments. These are the practical steps. It isn't going to be big, huge solutions. So the last question in terms of division within the church, for instance, would apply to this, and then I'll come to the next question or comment. And that is, the program to heal the division in the church is not to write furious letters to your bishop or to harangue your priest. There's a time for making comments and so forth. I'm not saying we never say anything. The real solution is to confess our own sins. The real solution is to change our own hearts. And it is not a coincidence that in the liturgy of the church, we pray the prayer of confession before communion, and we acknowledge that we in that prayer, not you, not the Greek church, not the bishop who hasn't got the sense to do this or that, but me, I individually and you individually, if you come to the Eucharist, will pray the prayer that God would forgive me, the greatest of all sinners. And so the Orthodox position is never, it's someone else's problem. Why don't the bishops get their act together? Why don't Greeks open their arms more and be less ethnic to Russians? Why don't Antiochians do this? That's not the problem. The problem is that every individual sitting here has to pray the prayer that says, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the bishop will take care of his own problems. But your problem is your heart, and my heart is my problem. And that's Orthodoxy's program. It isn't a program of social engineering or vast church building. It's a program of individuals becoming holy people. And that is where it is different than kind of society-building Protestantism. The society-building part is the result. It's part of the fruit, but it isn't the reason. The reason and the source is the change of our own hearts. And that's why we need the monastic example.
From a monastery, thank you for your comment. It's refreshing to hear your comment. A comment and a question. I travel extensively to preach. I try to give retreats for young people, particularly. Retreats for those coming to Orthodoxy, those born into it. And I hear all the time, we need monasticism, we need monks, we need nuns. Well, we're not from Benbush. You can't go to the A&E or Kroger and I'll sit and look for monks. You want monasteries? You have to support them. We don't come out the sky. It's your sons and daughters. It's you after your sons and daughters have grown. So why, we're losing an awful lot of traditions in this country. I'm an immigrant. I was raised in the faith. And one of the things that distresses me is we're losing a lot of the ethos, the Orthodox ethos. In trying to become Americans, we're becoming Protestants. And one of the things we're losing is the idea that you can end your life in a home. You can raise your children, and husband and wife go off to monastery. In Greece, they still do that. In Russia, they still do that. But I hear this, we want monasteries, we want monasteries. Where are our here? There are what, 4 or 5 Orthodox churches in Atlanta? We're just 4. We're proud. We have 12 people who want to build buildings.
Here, here.
$1,000 in a box for the building and kiss my hand.
Yeah.
Encourage your children, please. And what I'd like you to please answer, I don't know the answer, is yes. We want people to support health. How? How on a parochial level, how on an individual level, an Orthodox Christian can effectively support monasticism.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I don't have the answer, but I have some thoughts because I've been doing a little bit of thinking about this, as is evident from my remarks. The first thing that we Orthodox Christians and we North Americans can do to support monasticism is become familiar with it. On a practical level, I would just say, if you're going to take a trip somewhere in this area and you're going to drive an hour and a half to some amusement park, you might be better served by driving the hour and a half and spending some time in the monastery. These are practical things. One reason it's tough being an Orthodox, by the way, and it was easy to be a Protestant, is Protestants always talked in airy-fairy, either political or social or theological things. Orthodox are horribly practical. You just saw an example of it. We're sitting here talking about monasticism. A real monk wanders in and says, "When are you coming to see my monastery?" Protestants talk about getting their heart right with the Lord. Some priest comes along and says, "Well, then stop doing that to your kid or your wife, or you can't take communion anymore." Orthodoxy is horribly practical. The rubber really hits the road when you become an Orthodox. So one thing that you can do is, first of all, be familiar with monasticism. Whether it's in your reading or your travels or your study together in Sunday school or the projects your churches do, here's a new thought. Instead of sending off your young people to a $350 a night hotel so they can get drunk, maybe have a little get-together at a monastery. That might even be Orthodox. Raise people to know monasticism not as something weird or exotic or frightening, but as commonly as they know the coffee hour. Monasticism should be part of Orthodox life in the same way that the most common things we do as Orthodox are common to us. That's part one. For ourselves and for our children. Let's get to know monasticism. Part two is this. Let's stop taking this Protestant idea from the culture that salvation is somehow a magical experience. Let me tell you something. There are a lot of Protestants who think they're going to be saved, quote, because they made a, quote, decision for Christ, as if you're going to be saved because of a theological formula. There are many Orthodox who, by the way, believe the same thing. Let me tell you how. They think that they are on the road to salvation because a priest said some magic words when they were baptized. And all they got to do is show up 3 times between now and the grave, and they're in. Neither of that is Orthodox. Orthodoxy regards salvation as a struggle, as Christ said it would be, a journey, as Christ said it would be, a race, as Paul said it would be. There are way stations on the race. Confession, liturgy, sacrament, and prayer and monasticism, amongst others. If we're not availing ourselves of those way stations of refreshment, instruction, guidance, and counseling, then we are essentially becoming Protestants. We're believing in a magic formula, and we're saying, no, salvation is not a journey. You just punch the button, and that's all there is to it. It's mechanical. And therefore, the second thing we can do after familiarizing ourselves with monasticism is get a better theology and go back to the Orthodox idea that salvation is a struggle. Why, as was said here a moment ago, which is perfectly true, by the way, in both the East and the West, was it the habit of most godly, not many, most in many places, godly and pious men and women to finish their days in monasteries? Well, it's because everybody realized that just in the Eucharist, as we sing that wonderful hymn, "Let us lay aside the cares of this world," when we approach the table of the Lord, it might be an idea to do more than sing about it at the end of our lives and actually lay aside most of the burdens and cares of this life and do what perhaps we should have been doing all along, but at least better late than never. Concentrate on our spiritual life. You know, Cosimo de' Medici, the great builder of the Renaissance, not an Orthodox by any means, but a pious man. I was just in his cell in San Marcos in Florence last week. And it's amazing because you say, here he is, Cosimo de' Medici, Pater Patrius of the whole nation of the Florentine state, and you expect to walk down the line of monks' cells, and then you would come to his, and it's really a door into a palace they've built behind it. But it isn't. His cell is standard issue, same size as everybody else's. Why? Because Cosimo de' Medici, for all his Renaissance desires and all the things that we would disagree with as Orthodox in terms of Western theology and everything else, was a man of his era, and most Christians in most places in most time realized that salvation was a journey, and a person like Cosimo de' Medici ended his days in the monastery he actually built. because it was Medici money that built and endowed and refurbished San Marcos. And instead of coming in there and putting a wall plaque on the icon he had given, okay, the reason he built San Marcos was not, this is Cosimo's thing. You know why he built San Marcos? Because he selfishly, and by the way, we're allowed to be spiritually selfish anytime we want. It's the only kind of selfishness you can have. He wanted to have a good monastery near him so that he could finish his days there. And so he said, my only request is this. I'm going to build, whatever it was, 120 cells, and Fra Angelico will paint the frescoes in them and so forth and so on. But at the end of the hall, down there at the bottom of the hall, right next to the toilet, you put a little cell for me. And I want to come finish my days here. And he did. So the fact of the matter is that first we have to introduce ourselves to monasticism again. And second, we have to make it a part of our lives and our children's lives and not an afterthought, and think of ways of doing that. Inviting monastics to our communities and going to see them and letting our children go to see them and visit them and having them come and asking them how to pray and so on and so on. Support them physically by building these monasteries, by contributing, and not just say, well, it's not our program, so we'll send them $80 while we put $80 million into the new parking lot. But do it as if it mattered. Put a little treasure in heaven instead of in our club. And then, lastly of all, ourselves, and the challenge well taken, Father, because it's something that speaks to me too. Let's not just talk about it and go around saying monasticism is great and maybe we'll visit once to Mount Athos someday as a kind of a pilgrimage. But what are we ourselves going to do? What am I going to do with my time and assets now? And if the opportunity arises at some point of my life, why would I not think of going into monasticism? And if one of my children talked about the monastic life, would I say, wait, you're smart. You could be a doctor. You could be a stockbroker. You could do something with your life besides praying and being a holy person. Well, on Judgment Day, I'll tell you whose shadow I'd rather be standing in. And if we don't believe that, we're not orthodox. And so we've got to change our mind on this thing. And monasticism, as the Father quite rightly says, will never get off the ground in this country unless we become horribly practical about it. And those are the concrete things, I think, some suggestions for that. And now I'll add one encouraging note at the end. A bit of this is already happening. Some progress has been made. I travel around the country and see Orthodox, and I'm surprised. I meet quite a few young people and older people who are considering the monastic life. I'll tell you about one I met again. In Holy Cross Monastery in Jerusalem, there is Sister Singletiki, who is a PhD psychology professor who taught both at Harvard and also in Cambridge University, and who was crushed nearly to death in the great Hyatt hotel disaster in Kansas City. And Sister Singletiki is a nun. In the world's view, she has, quote, wasted her life. Okay? I only had a half an hour with her, and yet I learned something from her. It has nothing to do with what I'm going to tell you, because I'm not going to share my personal spiritual journey. That's your own business. But I learned something from her in a half an hour of being with her about piety that I didn't learn from any books I ever read. And I'd rather have Sister, one of the best things that happened to me on that trip is Sister Singletiki promised that she would pray for me every day. And I'll tell you something, that's a much more important relationship than a stockbroker who calls you every day. And the fact of the matter is, there are people of tremendous caliber spiritually, some with great credentials from the world, some with no credentials. But the church, that has nothing to do with spirituality, as we know. I don't think that St. Mary of Egypt had a PhD from any place, the last time I checked. The church is a great equal level playing field when it comes to that. But yet, there are people who in the world's eyes, it surprises them that they are becoming monastics. And there's more than one. And there is a trend, and I think it's a trend not of a man-made thing, but the Holy Spirit. And it's our job to see that the wind is blowing that way and do something about it. We'll have one more question briefly, and then we'll wrap it up and make room for the coming wedding party.
You made a comment earlier about how when you walk into the Orthodox Church, you recognize that the church because there are icons and the icons all over the town. And as somebody who can't see but knows these channels are very there, I have to make one friend, and they come in and they assure you. And then they get to a point, where really, one time we're about to take it, then somehow something stop there and say, you know, we are trapped.
Mm-hmm. You bring up something that's very poignant. The question in the comment is that you have many Protestant friends, they come into the Orthodox Church, they're intrigued, and then at a certain point, like the rich young ruler, the cares of their own life overwhelm their interest in Orthodoxy. It can come in many ways. People who say, well, what would my family think? Or I'm an elder in my church, or I'm a pastor, and this is how I earn my living. So how could I become Orthodox? I would lose my livelihood. Or less dramatic ways of, I'll be frank, just ego. Women who are very used to being in the feminized Protestant church where you can all have your own home Bible study and say whatever you want. And in the name of spirituality and piety, you can basically do whatever it is you wanted to do anyway and say, God led me to do it. And no priest or monk will tell you differently. The Protestant tradition, and I speak now personally, not judging anyone else, I speak for myself because I am an arrogant pig inside many, many times. I speak only for myself. But the Protestant church taught me to be arrogant. It taught me that if I was clever enough to extrapolate something out of a Bible verse, then God said it. And so I would say things, or I'd hear people say, the Lord led me to do this, or some things like this and so on. It was funny how the Lord always led me to do what I was going to do anyway. The Lord was excellent that way. He was the most compliant priest I've ever met. But the fact of the matter is, therefore, I don't want to be rude and I don't want to offend anybody, but Protestantism is the supreme training ground for supreme arrogance and self-sufficiency. After all, America's individualism came from somewhere. And the fact of the matter is, it's done in the name of spirituality. Invariably, a Protestant man or woman will come up to me and say, yeah, but Jesus speaks to my heart. Who are you to tell me I need the church? Well, precisely. It is the ultimate egotistical trip to say it's just me and God. I don't answer to anybody except Jesus. Try that with your mother or teacher. It doesn't work. But for some reason, theologically, people get away with it. They say, I don't need the church or the sacrament or confession or a monk or holiness or any of these things. I just answer to Jesus. Well, a traffic cop doesn't buy that excuse, and obviously the church's saints did not do that. I was going 80 miles an hour. God led me to do it. I answer to Jesus. You're still going to be fined $150. Maybe that's what Rodney King said that got him in all that trouble. You never know. I just answer to Jesus. Well, it doesn't work in the real world. And the fact of the matter is, to those of us who were Protestants or are Protestants, we got to be honest about something. And that is, we come from a background of individualism in which it's just me and my Bible and whatever I think, and my little home Bible study that I get a big charge out of leading, and I can say God is speaking through me, and I suddenly have all these gifts of the Spirit one morning because I decide I'm charismatic, or I suddenly decide I'm a pastor because I feel like doing sermons. It's self-made. If you look at holiness through the church, it's not self-made. The great ascetics were not sent into the desert by their spiritual fathers, usually until they themselves had been monks or nuns for years. The humble life and the gifts of the Spirit were not things that people sought out and demanded. They came as gifts from God, from people who were willing to work at them within the spiritual discipline of everyone else. They didn't consider themselves as special cases. They too took the Eucharist and went to confession and were disciplined. And so the thing is, in America, especially Protestant America, we all want to be the individual special case. And again, and I'll finish on this note, lest it be looking at the mote in our brother's eye, not looking at the beam in our own. What do you think all this nonsense with parish councils in this country is about? Stiff-necked pride of people who want to be just me and God. There are even churches, my bishop in Boston, Bishop Methodius, was telling me one time, we were discussing this problem, how Protestantized some Orthodox churches are, that they don't even gladly obey their bishops. He had a parish council president come to him one time and say, who are you to tell me what to do? Literally. And Bishop Methodius, who's quite a young bishop, looked at him and he said, I was so surprised I didn't know what to say. And so he said, I mumbled something like, I'm your bishop. And we're talking about a church matter here. And, we have a 2,000-year history where, as Ignatius of Antioch said it, the bishop stands in the place of Christ, not because he's perfect, but because the alternative, which is chaos and dissent, And stiff-necked parish councils and Protestantism is worse. And the buck's got to stop somewhere, even if it stops on a very imperfect desk. And so the fact of the matter is, we Orthodox are just as Protestantized in this area as other people. We have our little programs and agendas and politics within our churches, and, we're going to push them forward. And the bishop and priest better not get in the way because, hey, this is my project, and it's just, me and God or my conscience or my whatever, and I'm going to do it. And so you have churches that chew up priests like cannon fodder. You have churches that disobey bishops. You have other churches that are not like that and have a much better reputation and everything in between. Why? Because like I said, I think we have two churches in America, and sometimes some congregations slide so far over the edge into the social club church and so far away from orthodoxy that they treat their bishop and their priests like, I was going to say like janitors, but it's an insult to janitors. And so how do we bring people to monasticism? We bring them to it by somehow realizing that we've got to be familiar with the tradition of holiness, humility, tradition of fighting against the passions of our heart with the Jesus prayer and the other tools the church gives us within the discipline and framework of the church, and that we're fools if we don't take advantage of the gift of monasticism. And I think it's beginning to happen. And I would just say, the last word, literally, I always say this is the conclusion, that this is like conclusion, final conclusion. The last word would be this, and that is we also have to be patient, because that too is part of orthodoxy. We think in America that if it isn't done by Wednesday or this afternoon, all is lost, and we want our money back. If you look at the historic Orthodox Church, it's 2,000 years old. Let's say we're at the beginning of a trend that brings monasticism to a full-blown life as it was, say, in certain eras of the church, and it takes 100 years. That will be a short amount of time. That'll be quick, as church history goes. And so let us also be patient and not spoil things by our demands and programs and try to push things too quickly so that we tear our house down around our head at the same time as we try to build it. God bless you, and that's the last question, and there's a wedding, and thank you.